Showgirls is widely considered to be a disaster, but I think it's a great movie. Not a great movie to make fun of, not a great cult movie, but simply a great movie. A first-class citizen of Filmville. In this video, I'll make the case for that outlandish claim in excruciating detail. So fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night. First off, let me remind you the vital signs of the film, the basic stuff. Showgirls is a 1995 film directed by Paul Verhoeven. It's hard to believe that the movie is almost 30 years old. It looks sharp. It looks new. I skipped over Verhoeven for a long time because I thought he was mainly a grindhouse director, which isn't something I'm really into. But then I saw his World War II drama, Soldier of Orange, which is an early Rutger Hauer movie, and I realized that Verhoeven is an insightful guy. That's a great historical movie. I strongly recommend Soldier of Orange. I thought, okay, fine, I'll watch RoboCop. And it turns out that's a great movie too. It's an interesting movie. On the surface, a lot of people might know Verhoeven for violence. But what I like about his movies is how deep they are. And I'm not merely talking about satire. Yes, there is some satire in his work that's pretty easy to latch onto, but there's a lot more to his movies than that. And there's a lot more to Showgirls than I think a lot of people have realized. Showgirls is rated NC-17. That's kind of one of the defining things about it. It's about a woman who dances at a strip club in Las Vegas before joining the cast of an upscale topless show at a hotel. So, as you can imagine, there are one or two moments in the film that do not feature nudity, and all the others do. This is probably the biggest NC-17 film ever made in terms of budget, in terms of gross, in terms of distribution, in terms of notoriety, maybe in terms of impact as well. There's something like Caligula, which predated the NC-17 rating. That had big actors in it. It was widely known. In some ways, it's comparable. I've reviewed Caligula on this channel, of course, and I can tell you it's an exploitation film. Showgirls is not, although maybe it was marketed as one a little bit. I'll come back to the marketing, to the reception, all this stuff later on. I'll talk about how audiences reacted to the explicit content, whether or not it was wise to make the movie NC-17, all this stuff I'll talk about if I remember to. Apparently, Verhoeven took a huge pay cut in order for the studio to agree from the beginning of the production that it was going to be an NC-17 film. Sometimes studios reach that at the end, almost by accident, or there's an R-rated movie in the NC-17 version or something like that. Well, from day one, they were planning to make an NC-17 rated film. Even if you hate the movie, you have to admire Verhoeven's boldness. As an interesting sidebar, I think there is a little bit of a history with NC-17 films in the early 90s. I don't really know if this is true, but my impression is that there was a little wave. There's more NC-17 films coming out at that time. Maybe it was part of this general resurgence of independent cinema in the mainstream at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. I'm not really sure, but this is probably part of that. The film was written by Paul Esterhaus. He wrote Dirty Dancing and Basic Instinct. One of those movies I think is okay. And it stars a bunch of people whose careers were more or less destroyed by the movie. A very common complaint about the film is that it was overacted. People were especially hard on leading actor Elizabeth Berkley for this. Of course, people don't complain about Arnold Schwarzenegger overacting in Total Recall, so maybe we have to do a bit of decoding to understand what people really mean when they say overacting, right? People say the movie's unrealistic. Well, lots of movies are unrealistic, but why is this an issue? We'll try to understand that. To be fair, I can see where people are coming from on both of those counts. None of the usual complaints about Showgirls are particularly surprising, but to be honest, I feel compelled to come to the defense of this movie more than most. I feel irked by a lot of the critiques of this film, much more than many movies. It's amazing to see how smug most people tend to be about Showgirls, how much they take it for granted that it's a terrible movie. I'm tempted to read to you some of the reviews of the film that really drive me crazy, but I don't want to draw out this video too much. I would just say that there are two main categories of viewers, two main categories of people who hate Showgirls. First, there are people who simply think that the movie is trash. They usually talk about the overacting, about it being not realistic. Often there's implications about the film being too graphic or too sleazy. They can't really understand the characters, why they act the way they do, all this stuff. The second category are viewers who think that this maybe is a good movie if you want to laugh, right? That it's an unintentional comedy. I saw a review on IMDb from some guy who said he rewatches the movie every 1 or 2 years just because he loves, well, I'm assuming it's a guy, just because they love to see how bad it is. What a strange way to spend your time. I don't know. There are also people who will say that actually that's the point of the movie. So there's people who think it's an unintentional comedy, the peak of unintentional comedy. That's why Showgirls is so great. And some people will say, no, that's the whole point. It's supposed to be campy. It's supposed to be funny. It's supposed to be silly. I do think there are fun elements to the film, definitely. But believe me, if you're watching this movie just to laugh at it, you're missing out on a lot. And if you think you have the intellectual high ground by laughing at the movie and criticizing it, well, I think this video will hopefully set you straight. Maybe not. I don't know. I'll come back to some of these particular criticisms when we get a little bit deeper into the movie. First, I want to start from the very, very beginning. When I was a child, I don't think I had a full picture of sexual politics. That's kind of a weird phrase. Maybe it's not the right one. I didn't have a full picture of the world, let's face it. I distinctly remember watching the sequel to Inspector Gadget, Inspector Gadget 2, I believe it's called. They switched actors in that film. I reviewed Inspector Gadget 1 on this channel, of course. Interesting video, go check it out. Anyway, I was not just watching the movie, I was watching the movie with the director's commentary. This was back in the day when you got DVDs from, you rented them from Hollywood Video or whatever, and you had to milk the DVD for everything it had. So you'd watch the movie, and then you'd watch the behind-the-scenes featurette, and then you'd watch the movie again with the commentary, and then finally you'd watch the trailers for the other movies that came with the DVD, and then once you were done with that, you'd just sort of scroll through the DVD menu. You'd look at the scene selection, and you'd look at the names for each chapter. Anyway, these are the good old days. Towards the end of Inspector Gadget 2, there's a big romantic kiss. Sorry to spoil the film for you, but there's a big romantic kiss, and I remember listening to the commentary of that scene where the actors are talking about filming this kiss. And I can distinctly remember thinking, wait a minute, how could they have kissed each other if they weren't in love? I mean, the characters were in love, obviously, but the actors are married to other people. Is there some special exception that allows actors to kiss other people? I mean, I thought you had to be in love to kiss somebody. It's kind of remarkable just how much of people's ideas about romance comes from movies. I mean, a huge percentage, even for people who are not children, right? I just didn't understand it. I had in my mind these very sort of firm Puritan, not really Puritan, but sort of pseudo-Puritan, classic, ideas about romance. And I guess I bring this up just because Showgirls is the exact opposite. In fact, that's not how the world works. There's a lot more to it than that, as you might know. Eventually, I got a little bit older and a little bit less naive, but I remember in my hometown of Olympia, Washington, there was an adult video store called Desire Video. I think it's gone now. We would always go past it on the way to the food co-op, and the place always seemed so sketchy. I mean, it looked like the sort of place you'd go to get murdered in an episode of CSI or something like that. It just looked dismal from the outside, and I never understood why people would go there. I mean, why would you pay money for something that is sort of so obviously bad? Like, to me, it seemed like, well, surely everybody realizes this is immoral. This is bad. This is evil, and yet this is a business. How does that work? At some point, I think they stopped making money as a video store, and so they opened up a strip club in the same place. It never made any sense to me. I never could wrap my head around it, and even today, I don't exactly understand why people go to strip clubs, but I know it's big business, right? It's a big thing. These industries, right, far from the wholesome love of Inspector Gadget 2, it turns out that there's actually huge industries around sex and libidinal activities in general, right? Apparently, almost 30% of streaming video on the internet is pornography, for instance. I don't know how they estimated that. Those numbers probably aren't quite accurate, but it's clear that the industrialization of sex is a big deal. It's a big part of our culture, and yet nobody really talks about it. It's a covert thing. There aren't very many movies about it. Finally, we get to the point, right? There are not very many movies that talk about this, even though it's kind of a huge piece of the world. There's Boogie Nights. There's Showgirls. I really can't think of much else. I know there's a ton of movies about prostitutes, okay? But they're almost all just kind of moralistic stories about, the dangers of falling into prostitution, right? The woman who lost all her money and got addicted to drugs and had to become a prostitute, right? There are very few movies about the business themselves. I'll talk about this more in a bit, but for now, can we just agree that this movie is operating in interesting territory? I mean, it's telling a story that we don't really see very often in Hollywood or really anywhere, right? It's talking about things that people do not talk about. That's kind of interesting. I mean, what is it like to be a topless dancer in Las Vegas? Any ideas? I don't know. Who are these people? How are their lives, both externally and internally, affected by the work they do? This is interesting stuff, I think. While we're in such a good mood, let's agree on a few more things too, okay? The cinematography in this movie is great. The camera movement is super dynamic. The colors are really vivid. The movie looks incredible. Big sets, right? Cool stuff. The music is also very good. The film has a lot of contemporary music, and I mean the score here. There's a lot of sort of pop songs, and it's really well selected. This leads us a little bit into the dance numbers, a question about the dance numbers. Are they high quality? But let's come back to that, because I think that the dance numbers are a little bit more complicated. In general, production quality, very high. And I mean, that's not very common for NC-17 films. I think this is, if not the most expensive NC-17 film ever made, one of them. And, you know, this film, at the very least, you have to admit, there's not a lot of movies like Showgirls. Okay, let's get to the good stuff. Let's talk about the first big virtue of the movie. I think it's that the film almost completely avoids moralism. I think this is actually a staple of Verhoeven's whole career. He made a bunch of films that are extreme, that are violent, that focus on touchy subjects, like Nazi collaborators during the war or policemen being turned into robots. Yet, he avoids making moralistic movies. You know, he makes extreme movies that are going to punch you in the face, that are going to poke at some, well, more than poke. They're going to open up some cans of worms, but they're not really moralistic. In Showgirls, it's easy to see where judgment could arise, right? Most of the things in this movie, people have feelings about these things. Many people, of course, would view working at a strip club as a bad use of time, or going to a strip club for that matter. A lot of people would find, you know, many of the things that happen in this film to be deplorable, unspeakable. Is there a chance that some of the people who would decry the film as being immoral would also visit a strip club when in Vegas, or that their husbands would? Well, it's possible. But either way, if you're looking for movies about the evils of Las Vegas, films that are they're condemning this stuff, well, this is not the movie. Verhoeven doesn't really condemn anything that happens. Although, to be fair, this does give a pretty clear-eyed view at some of the exploitative nature of the system. There's some extreme stuff in the film. There are a couple of deeply sort of disturbing moments, but I think the film doesn't really do much to tip its hand about how Verhoeven feels about all this stuff. Like I said, it doesn't really rush to condemn anything. Maybe one or two of like the most extreme things, but even those are played pretty neutrally. There, of course, are going to be people on the other side of things, right? There are people who believe that it's morally important to be in solidarity with sex workers. Or perhaps they would say that Nomi isn't a sex worker, but that stripping is actually one of the burlesque arts, which should be admired, right? Should be promoted as an art form. You'll have to think about how this squares with the actual conditions of these people in this movie. But if you're hoping to find a celebration of sisterhood or a bunch of progressive talking points, well, this also is not the movie for you. This is a film that doesn't moralize in either direction. In Showgirls, when it comes to morality, I think the key word is ambiguity. Here's a simple question for you. Are the dancers in this film prostitutes? Well, Nomi would say no. She doesn't think of herself as a prostitute, but Crystal, the most senior dancer in the hotel show, we'll talk about her a lot in a little bit. She does think of herself as a prostitute, more or less. She kind of explicitly says that she is one. As dancers, they don't get paid for intercourse, although at times that does seem to be expected, or maybe it's a joke, or maybe there's a way out of it, or maybe not. It's a gray area. Okay, maybe they're not being paid for intercourse directly, but they still have an interesting relationship with the audience. I mean, Crystal says, hey, we know what they want, and we're giving it to them for money, right? So are they selling their bodies? Well, I don't know. You might think that people would have a strong sense of what they are doing, or clearly defined boundaries. I mean, you might think that people working in these situations would know what they're doing and would have some moral framework for thinking about their lives. But this isn't necessarily the case. Or maybe if some people think about it one way, other people think about it the other way. Clearly, it's ambiguous. It's a gray area. And that's interesting. I mean, you would sort of think like, very simple question. Is Showgirls about prostitutes? That might divide opinion. I guess technically speaking, you would say no. Is Showgirls about sex workers? That's a question for you. I'll leave that one to you. Here's another question. Which show is more legit? Is it The Cheetah, a sleazy strip club, or the show Goddess at this big Vegas hotel? I forget the name of the hotel, but at first you might think that obviously the hotel is more legit. It's more moral because it's a bigger production. It's a bigger institution. They've got fancy costumes. They've got nice facilities. It costs more to go there. They've got choreographers. There's a lot of stuff coming out of Broadway that sort of makes its way to the hotel. A number of the characters seem to think that they're in the film All That Jazz. Clearly, some of them are very talented, right? There's some talented dancers. But it is still a topless show. I mean, what are people coming to see? Is it the choreography? The actual performance, I think, is fairly cheesy. I mean, the show's called Goddess. The dancers are still coerced into sex off screen. One of the characters in the film says that he thinks the cheetah is more legit because there it's honest. People come in and you know what they're doing there, right? Maybe this fancy hotel is really the same thing as a strip club, but it's simply sleaze for people with more money. I really don't know. Honestly, it's a fascinating question to me about how does like the seediness and sleaziness work at different socioeconomic classes? Because there's almost some implication that when you get into luxury life, like people are more moral or something like that. Obviously, that's not true. And if anything, it might be the opposite. I mean, some movies would have you believe it's the opposite. What is it? I mean, how do these different sort of things break down between socioeconomic classes? Is that the only difference between these venues? I don't know. But look, there's so many questions here. You might think that the industry would have this clear structure, like, here's the refined stuff over here. Here's the exploitative stuff. Here's the sophisticated stuff. Here's the classy stuff, right? Here's the lowbrow stuff. Here's the highbrow stuff. But I don't know. Doesn't really seem that way. It's kind of all a gray area. And I think that's interesting. And I think there might be something kind of profound there about the way that these sort of libidinal industries are the way they function, the way they're organized. I don't know. Verhoeven and Eszterhas interviewed around 200 dancers and prostitutes when they were preparing for the movie. And honestly, I think it shows. As outsiders, we have a tendency to want to moralize about all this stuff, but I doubt that people working these jobs think about it in the same way. I don't know exactly how they think about it, but I doubt it's the same way that the average middle American would. Some people do have some boundaries or moral frameworks, but it's clear that it's an ambiguous thing. Different people say different things. They feel different ways about it. It's hard to know what you should do, and yet the world goes on. The show goes on. People do these jobs in real life. Okay, some people feel like this movie is really unrealistic, but I don't know. To me, I do think it answers a lot of these questions, not in a way that I can really express to you exactly. I mean, I'm going to try a little bit later on, but I think the movie does have... It feels like a vibrant truth regarding what it means to work in this kind of libidinal industry. Okay, I should note that this isn't a totally relativist film. It does show pretty clearly how the women are taken advantage of. I mean, I mentioned already, no punches pulled, very clear-eyed look at how their workplaces are structured to extract the most value. The owner of the strip club, for instance, his name's Al. He's a very strong character, actually. We see him lay out the rules a few times, and it's clear that they're exploitative. He pushes women to do things that they probably wouldn't otherwise because there's money in it, right? You see it happen very clearly, and man, it's telling. It's telling. Still, the movie doesn't really moralize about this, and Al actually ends up with some endearing moments. Very interesting character. I think one thing that hurt this movie a little bit, in addition to all the extreme content, is that the film kind of lacks a moral structure. In a lot of movies, the plot is somehow oriented by morality, right? The plot and morals are kind of linked together somehow. There are the good guys and the bad guys. Well, naturally, they fight each other, right? Or there's a main character that makes their way towards the light, makes their way towards absolution. For most of this movie, it's hard to find anything like that at all. In fact, from the beginning, Nomi is marked not necessarily as this good person, really. She moves from the cheetah to the hotel, and you think, okay, she's made it to the big time. But wait, in some ways, it's just as sleazy. And if anything, her spirit seems to darken. I mean, again, should we even be rooting for her at all? I don't know, right? I think this makes the movie maybe hard to parse for some people, but to me, it's a virtue because this is life, right? Where is the moral rule book You know, I mean, there are some out there, but which is the one? I don't know. And that's not to endorse any form of relativism or whatever, but it's just to say that this stuff is hard to think about and it's hard to know. And it's like, man, you think about all the uncertainty and all the back and forth just in America, all the moral panic surrounding some of this stuff and all the hand-wringing about this stuff happening from people who aren't even on the ground, who don't know what's going on. What must it be like to actually be doing this? I mean, you think about the uncertainty and the ambiguity. Showgirls has a huge dose of my favorite thing in film and in life, which is uncertainty. Having said that, I do think that Nomi does find some kind of absolution. I'm not going to go too deeply into the end of the movie. The end is so interesting. I mean, I could make just a separate movie, just a separate video, just about how they wrap this movie up. I think that she finds some things that she really values, right? There is some absolution, some self-discovery. Nomi, interesting name for a character. In particular, the few sincere relationships that she stumbles into in the film, the few nuggets of sincerity that she finds out in Las Vegas do seem to be pretty important to her. So, again, not totally relativist, but a film that really steers away from moralism. Okay, sincerity. Sincerity is another huge keyword for the movie, and don't forget sincerity's good friend, illusion. This takes us back, I think, to the main criticism of the film, which is that it is overacted. Now, I didn't read anything about this movie before watching it. I read the title of the movie, that was it. Honestly, just going into it cold, I thought the acting was fine, right? Obviously, it's not naturalistic. Also, if you've watched the channel at all, you know that my taste in film is not really in this area at all. I tend to like serious, very naturalistic, like psychological realism, and this movie is not that. But I don't think this movie is any more over the top than the average film from the 1980s. Maybe slightly more over the top, but not really. Once you get into the movie, I don't think you're going to notice it much, unless, of course, your goal in watching the movie is to dislike it. Then, yes, you will be able to poke at tons of interesting stylistic quirks or the weird tone of the film or all this stuff. But if you get into the movie, I don't think it's really going to be much of a factor at all. I was looking through some of the somewhat specious trivia about the film on IMDb. Yep, I do check the old IMDb trivia section from time to time. And one of the entries, I really got a kick out of this one. One of the pieces of trivia said that, one thing I should just say about IMDb trivia is there are no citations in any of this stuff. Drives me crazy, right? So you should really be careful with anything that is said there. And I would recommend reading Wikipedia for your movie trivia and following the citations a little bit. Anyway, one of these pieces of trivia said that Elizabeth Berkley's terrible performance actually wasn't her fault. Apparently, Paul Verhoeven admitted in interviews that he asked her to exaggerate her performance. He asked her to exaggerate, so he's to blame, right? What was he thinking? He asked her to exaggerate? Man, what a fool. Well, another way of looking at this is that maybe the over-the-top nature of the film is intentional. If Verhoeven asked his actors to do it, maybe he had some reason for this. But what would he know? Look, first of all, I think it's clear that the tone of the film is a little bit unorthodox. It's not unprecedented, but it's a little bit different. It's a very gritty movie in some ways, and I think in some ways a very realistic movie. I mean, I touched on that already. I think there's some deeply realistic things here. I think there's also some sort of over-the-top grittiness in the film. There's also just kind of a surreal nature to the whole thing, right? A lot of kind of over-the-top, in-your-face stuff. Sounds a bit like Las Vegas, maybe. I thought that Verhoeven signposted this pretty well, the way he started the movie, but apparently not well enough to get the average viewer on board. The movie starts with Nomi being picked up from the side of the highway. There's some sign that says, oh, Las Vegas, so-and-so miles away. She's picked up by some 1980s guy, and there's really sort of an Americana tilt to all this stuff. The movie is also, from the very beginning, invoking a particular relationship between men and women. There's something sort of adversarial about that. So that's also a key thing in the way that sort of the tone is set from the film. And yes, maybe your first impression of Nomi might be, what the heck is wrong with her? But again, I think there are some pretty clear signposts that the place they're setting off to isn't quite real. And maybe the place they're starting from isn't quite real either. I mean, she's picked up just in some random town on the side of the road. How did you get there, right? We're heading somewhere. There's something a little bit fantastic about this whole thing. Fantasy, right? This is also a movie that's doing something interesting with the senses. Of course, Las Vegas has always been the realm of the senses. Maybe the new Sphere embodies that better than anything. But look, it's always been the case. Well, I don't know about always, but Las Vegas has not existed since for all of eternity. But you know what I mean. The realm of the senses sort of being deconstructed here in a way by the style of the film, by the tone of the movie. So yes, it's over the top, but I don't think it's a bad fit. And I also I'm a little bit surprised that people just are so bewildered by the tone of the film, because it's far from unprecedented. There's plenty of other movies that do something similar. We talk about One from the Heart, which I reviewed on this channel. Of course, that was a notorious flop as well, so maybe that's not a good example. Some of the Wim Wenders road movies are kind of similar. Of course, some of those were huge flops. What's that movie with Natural Born Killers? That comes to mind. That is a little bit more on the grindhouse side of things for me. Also, interestingly, another NC-17 film coming out in a similar time period. I forget exactly when that was released, but anyway, not exactly unprecedented, but it sure threw people for a loop. Here's why I think this was a good choice for the movie, though, why I think this tone makes sense. I mentioned already that it's Las Vegas, right? And Las Vegas is defined by illusion and fakery to some extent. But beyond this, Las Vegas in general, I think this is also pretty apropos of the strip clubs and, this topless dance stuff that is the focus of the movie, right? Because these sort of libidinal industries are a place where illusion is a big deal, right? It's kind of central to the whole experience. Illusion, fantasy. To many people, sincerity is a cornerstone of intimacy. I mean, how could you have intimacy without sincerity? That's sort of how I feel. But there is one way. At least you could go to a strip club, right? And you could pay somebody money to have an experience that is intimate, right? I mean, it is intimate, but it's also fake. You see in this movie that there's a whole grammar to this. There's a whole grammar of the strip club, which I will admit to not being well versed in, but, there are expectations, there are rules. This stuff would never happen in real life. Nobody would ever do this. There's even coming down to the way that people dance or whatever. It's not something that, well, I don't get out much, but I don't think, like I said, I don't think any of this stuff happens anywhere else, basically. And yet there's this whole world and there's this whole language. Some of it is explained explicitly. Others is just kind of people know or whatever. To me, this all seems like it would be hollow, like it would be fake, like it's, dishonest or something like that, and unfulfilling. But people do spend their money in these places. And actually, I suspect that just about everyone has some kind of fantasy, right? I talk about how, well, it's so hollow or whatever. It's not real, it's dishonest. But fantasy, what about fantasy, right? Most people have fantasies of some kind, and a fantasy is almost by definition not real, right? Or involves something that's not real, perhaps some kind of fakery. So this is a quagmire already. I mean, you can tell I'm getting confused. We're just getting started. These libidinal industries they're balancing things. They're balancing a need for sincerity, maybe, and they're balancing a desire for illusion or something like that, right? Why do people use OnlyFans, for instance? I mean, why do people follow really small creators on OnlyFans? I read some crazy statistic once that the vast majority of people on OnlyFans make no money, essentially, which is anyway, that's a whole other topic. But why are people interested in following these smaller creators? Well, probably because it gives them more of a sense of personal connection when they're following this amateur, right? A personal connection. Why do people pay money to get custom videos made for them? Again, there's some sort of personal connection, some form of intimacy, but it's obviously fake, right? Are people just fooling themselves, or do they know this? I don't know. On the other side of things, I think part of the moral panic around sex work is really rooted in the idea that it is dishonest, right? And that because it is dishonest, it somehow imperils genuine romance at a global scale, right? If people are paying for sex or something like that, well, how can anyone have a genuine relationship, right? This is sort of sketching out the moral panic surrounding prostitution sometimes, or something like that. Anyway, I can tell you honestly that I don't know what to make of most of the moral questions in this space, right? I took a philosophy course in college. One of the questions was, should you be allowed to sell anything, right? And of course, the main questions about that, there's a great book by, what's his name, Michael Sandel, about this. Should you be able to sell anything? Well, at first you think, well, surely. Okay, what about selling a spot in line, right? Is it moral to sell a spot in line? Well, at airports, there's these systems like Clear or whatever that are allowing you to skip the line. I don't feel so good about that. It feels a little bit not egalitarian or something like that. What about selling the dedication to a book? Can you sell the dedication to a book? Okay, what about prostitution and selling your organs? Those are the ones that people mainly bring up. And it's interesting because there's ways that progressives can get really confused by some of these questions, because in some ways you want to support sex workers or whatever, you want to support people like that. But on the other hand, these industries can be very exploitative. So where were we? I don't know. The point is that, well, okay, I guess I slipped a little bit back into talking about morality, which is the last section. Here we're trying to talk about illusion, right? And honesty. Okay, in some ways it's really important that these things are honest. Like, that seems to matter to people. Like, honesty seems to be a key thing here, right? On the other hand, it clearly is not honest. It clearly is illusory, and people seem to be okay with that. And if anything, that might be a key, like a cornerstone of fantasy. Okay, so what? So how do you put these things together? Well, look, that's Vegas. What can I tell you? And that's the kind of over-the-top and wild tone of the film, maybe. This movie, of course, is focused on the girls in the show, so it's not so much about why people go to strip clubs or about how the general public feels about it. It's about the people working there, right? How does participating in all these strange relationships? That's what they are. You have quite odd relationships with people, sort of professional relationships, but I just can't imagine really what this does. Maybe nothing. I mean, I don't want to make a big fuss out of it. I'm not saying that it's like some crazy thing necessarily, but it must have some impact. How does doing all this stuff, how does doing it for money, how does it affect a person? What is the essence of this phantasmagoria of Las Vegas and these libidinal industries, right? Now, I'm not saying that all these themes justify every single stylistic choice in the movie. I think it actually would be possible to make this film much more naturalistically. In fact, I think that movie already exists. Ooh, can you guess the movie I'm about to say? Directed by John Cassavetes, The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, right? That's kind of the naturalistic version of this movie in some ways. Of course, it's about a guy. Anyway, if you hate the tone of Showgirls, that's fair enough. But I found it cohesive and engaging, and I do think it really uncovers, I think it works with a lot of these questions about illusion. I think it makes sense. I think that the larger than life feeling of the movie also opens the door for something really important, which is sincerity. Might seem a bit backwards, but if you take this movie seriously, I think you're going to find a few moments of sincerity, particularly towards the end. And I kind of mentioned this already, that Nomi stumbles into a few things that seem to cut through all the razzle-dazzle. I think this is important. This is a big part of the movie. A lot of stuff in this movie is either obviously insincere, way over the top, or it's just a bit untrustworthy. You are always wondering if people are on the level. And I mean, look, that's Las Vegas. It's like you're walking around inside of a casino. I've never been to a casino, but well, that's not true. When I was in middle school, we had a day where everybody spoke Spanish, and you had like a little local fair, and someone ran a casino at their booth. That's the closest I've gotten to Vegas. Anyway, you're walking around a casino, someone offers you a drink, somebody says something nice to you. What do you make of this? Right? It's a totally different space. It's a totally different place to live. And I mean, look, I know the city itself is like, whatever, it's just a place. But you know what I mean? There is like a different sort of social arrangement in some of these places. So, similarly in this movie, you're always wondering, like, this person shows up. Are they on the level? Are they working some angle? Maybe this just comes with the territory, right? When you're working in an industry that is all about illusion and all about seduction. Still, there are a couple of moments of something real. Couple moments of something real. One thing that really didn't help this movie is that it was marketed lasciviously. I think a lot of the ads for the film played into the NC-17 nature of the movie. This is one thing that's just such a bummer that the marketing department, and I mean, look, it's no surprise. You get the sophisticated auteur director from Europe is making the film. He's got everything under control. He's negotiated into his contract from day one. This is going to be an NC-17 film. We're going to do some crazy stuff here. And then it falls to the marketing department to promote the film. And of course, a different idea about what the purpose is and all this stuff could arise within those walls. This film, I think, had some, like, there was some like sneak preview video that was explicit as a videotape that was like circulating at video stores to promote the film. The tagline on the ads for this film was "Leave your inhibitions at the door." Right? This is a total misrepresentation of the movie. Eszterhas, the screenwriter, took out an ad in Variety to denounce the way the film was marketed. And I feel for him, although I'm not sure I agree exactly with his view of the essence of the movie. But anyway, viewers were never going to get the most out of this film if they came into it expecting something like really raunchy. Maybe it sounds silly to say that this isn't a raunchy movie because it has almost constant nudity in it, but let me point something out. Point out something interesting. Okay. There's really only one scene in this whole movie, well, maybe two, where it's clear that Nomi is trying to be seductive. There's like two actually romantic scenes in the whole movie, right? There's a lot of sexual tension in the movie, clearly, throughout. A lot of sexual tension. But there's like two romantic scenes. And guess what? They're seductive, right? They're compelling. So you can easily find reviews of this movie saying, well, this sucks. It isn't sexy at all, right? Or the director must be a creep if he thought this was hot. I think the reality is that this is not supposed to be a raunchy movie because there are one or two scenes that have more heat and the rest of it is sleazy and kind of hard to watch. That's the point, right? Okay, you can find reviews where people say, hey, the dancing in this movie is terrible. What were they doing? The choreography is sleazy. It looks bad. I kind of agree with that, right? I think there are two dance numbers at the hotel that are good. Mainly, they're good in that they really carry the energy of the movie forward. I like that. But a lot of the other stuff just seems a bit off. If you watch a movie like All That Jazz, even if you've never seen anyone dance before, you'll probably think, wow, these people are good. That's cool. That's not the case here at all. Remember, though, we start out at a seedy strip club. Then we go to a seedy topless show. Why would the dancing be good in these places? I think that Verhoeven actually nails the dance numbers, the big production in this film. At the strip clubs, the proceedings are really tinged with this like desperation and seediness. It's really kind of pathetic. The dancing is, just kind of over the top. At the hotel, things are glamorous, but also gaudy. I mean, you wonder what the heck the show is even about. It's called Goddess, right? They have a volcano in it at one point. There's a number with a bunch of bikers, all kinds of random stuff. It's that this part I think is a little bit of a farce. It's I don't know. I think there's a pretty deep irony about the way the film was marketed, actually, because it's clear that a big theme in the movie is the spectrum of art and sleaze. I already kind of talked about this in the beginning. Like, you're at the Cheetah, which is this sort of this honest venue or whatever, and then you go to sort of the more like fancy hotel. But is it really any different? Like, where is art? Where's the stuff? Because there are like artistic burlesque shows out there, certainly, right? Maybe not in this movie. Well, I don't know. Dancing is clearly, in certain forms, quite sophisticated, right? But in other forms, it is going to be looked down on by many people. What is the spectrum? How does it work? How do you know which is which? What's the good stuff? What's the classy stuff? And what's the sleazy stuff? Well, it's an unstable thing. Remember, also, we have this plotline with James. I guess I haven't even mentioned James yet. There's a guy in the movie who seems more committed to dancing as art. He works a bunch of different jobs as a security guard, valet, all this stuff. He doesn't want Nomi to work in the hotel. He writes a piece for her. Okay, maybe he's lying. Maybe it wasn't written for her. He does use the piece to get another girl to sleep with him. One thing that is interesting about, I mentioned there's sort of two genuine, or two scenes where Nomi really seems to be interested in seduction. Both of them are some of the more genuine moments in the film, but they're not on the level exactly. Is James just looking to get her in bed? Maybe. You don't really know. Later on, I'm not going to spoil things, but later on, maybe she's trying to seduce somebody else, right? That's kind of interesting. So again, distrust is like woven so deeply into the culture that's on display in this movie, and that's pretty interesting. Anyway, James seems to care about this thing. He writes this piece, seemingly for Nomi, but then he finds someone else to perform it. Eventually, they perform it at some club, and it is a suggestive piece, but maybe it has some more artistic something to it. They're up on the stage at this place, and they're doing their thing, a little bit more sophisticated maybe, and they get booed off, right? They get booed off stage. So, again, what is what? What's the spectrum of the sleaze and the art? Well, what's the irony? The irony is that in the movie, this hotel show, right, is kind of the sleazy thing, but it's marked with some signs of sophistication, right? The hotel is sleazy, but it's sort of marked up as this classy thing. Well, the movie itself, Showgirls, I think is actually very sophisticated. But how is it marketed? Well, as being lowbrow. That's interesting. Ultimately, I think another place where a lot of viewers got lost when they were watching this movie was in the quagmire of art and sexuality, right? What is this? Which happens to be one of the main themes of the movie, that these things are unstable and hard to separate sometimes and divisive, right? How do these things relate to each other? Man, I don't know, right? So it's kind of ironic that people got really confounded by this when they watched the movie and they're like, is this some sleazy exploitation thing? Like, what's the point? Is it an art film? Well, yeah, I think it definitely is. But that memo didn't really get out there. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the character Crystal. Man, I have a lot to say about this movie. And I'm trying to keep this as short as possible. But let's talk about Crystal, because she invokes a lot of things that people hate about this movie and a lot of things that I think are actually pretty important about the movie. Crystal is the lead of the show at the hotel. In case you've forgotten, the basic idea of this whole movie is that Nomi rolls into town with basically nothing, but she bumps into a girl named Molly that helps her out. It's very conspicuous how Nomi bumps into all these different people in Vegas. That's not an embarrassing failure to make a realistic movie. It's an invocation of something like an Alger Hiss storyline, some kind of Americana, right? It's a nod to some idea about bootstraps, the great American bootstraps. Of course, one of the cinematic precursors to the film is All About Eve. That's why I started the video the way that I did. All About Eve is really in the room with you when you watch Showgirls, unless you haven't seen All About Eve, in which case, what are you doing? But anyway, this movie has kind of a classic grammar to it. At times, it has kind of this American thing. Anyway, it turns out that Molly is a seamstress for this dance show at the hotel. Nomi starts living with her, and she visits the show a few times. She bumps into Crystal and all this stuff. Things start to come together, but at the time, she's working at the strip club called the Cheetah. Ultimately, it's Crystal that gives Nomi a chance to sort of move up the ladder, although, as we've discussed, is it really going up the ladder? Who knows, right? Crystal is far, far from an ally. I mentioned that she helps her out, but yeah, is she really her friend? Well, throughout the film, it's not exactly clear how Crystal feels about Nomi or really anything. It seems at times that maybe Crystal wants to help Nomi. At other times, it seems like she hates Nomi and wants to destroy her. At other times, it seems like she has an enormous crush on Nomi. There's a ton of tension. I think a lot of viewers might be confused by this. Actually, I think that they might find both Crystal and Nomi to be inexplicable. That's probably a major criticism of the movie from a lot of people, is that they don't understand why the characters are doing what they're doing. They're not rational, dramatic agents, I would say. They make choices that a lot of characters in movies do not make. I kind of feel like one of the reasons why people say that this movie is unrealistic, what they're really saying is, well, wait a minute. People in most movies wouldn't do this, so why are they doing this? They're comparing this to the cinematic reality rather than the actual reality, right? I think it's something a bit deeper going on with these characters. Something a bit different than the traditional sort of dramatic logic. What is it? Well, first of all, there's sort of a very basic sense of realism here, right? Nomi and Crystal both had pretty odd lives. They both have extreme lifestyles. They do cocaine, for instance. So maybe odd, the occasional erratic move is not that crazy. It's not to be unexpected, right? So in some ways, like I said, it is realism. But that's kind of a cynical perspective. Part of the story, I think, is that this movie is simply not moving along traditional dramatic axes. Okay, that's a bit vague, but let me try and be more specific. Some of the axes that the movie does make use of are these: tension, attention, cattiness, and agency. I think those four ideas can help you make a lot of sense of what Nomi and Crystal do. Okay, first of all, they both have big personalities. What does that even mean? A big personality. You hear that a lot. There's a scene in the movie where some of the producers of the show are talking about the different dancers, and they keep saying that Crystal has heat, right? In this industry, personal and professional traits kind of blend together. That's kind of interesting. Something as personal as your body is also like a big part of your career, or something as sort of intangible as heat is a big part of your career, right? To be this good, like, topless dancer, you need to have heat. Well, what is that? What? How do you... They say, well, you can't teach that or something like that. Oh, she learned it, but you can't teach it. There's a couple funny sayings in the movie about that I think are in there on purpose, because it's sort of challenging this question of, like, what does this really mean, and what does it mean to be good at this thing, you know? Anyway, these skills that you have, or these traits that you have that are professional but also personal, what are they? One of them is like the ability to command the spotlight, right? Maybe Crystal has this built into her somehow, a compulsion to perform. This is what I talk when I talk about tension and attention. It's a performance in some ways. Her erratic behavior off the stage maybe is related to this sort of general like sensibility of maintaining attention, this general like sense of performance, right? Maybe she's doing it everywhere. Okay, that's pretty easy to wrap your head around. It's not quite as simple as that she's just always performing, but really that the movie profoundly is speaking in these terms of attention and tension, and that these are things that are like at a deep personal level. They're part of your like image entrepreneurship that you carry with you through your life that makes you a professional in this industry, right? Okay. Then there's cattiness. In the 1930s, there were a ton of very catty movies, like Stage Door. That's a great movie. What a cool movie. But, cattiness is kind of the whole logic of that film. Of course, All About Eve has plenty of that in it as well. At a certain time, this would have been very legible as a dramatic mode, and I think it still kind of is. I really don't think that cattiness is its own thing, and it's almost sort of misogynistic to assert that cattiness like is a thing. But it's maybe something that arises from a certain type of rivalry. It is something that does have a name, though. You know what I mean? And it does have a grammar. Like, people understand what it means to be catty, and it is something that people play into. It's almost fun to play into in a way, or something like that. Anyway, I'm going to try and keep this part short because this video is going to be so long. But anyway, cattiness is certainly a part of a movie, and people are participating in that. Okay, this is another thing that explains these seemingly erratic choices the characters are making. Okay, there's also an angle that is much less pejorative. In some ways, Nomi and Crystal's sort of bold moves are a step towards agency, I think, a reflex against all the exploitative stuff that happens to them, right? Yeah. Tough industry to work in. It's like you're almost gasping for air, and some form of like acting out or something like that is the one way to do it, steering your own path. Okay, I think those things help to understand like why people do what they do. A big part of this movie is trying to understand this. Like a big part of this movie is grappling with this. This is a character study in many ways. I mean, I've sort of started at this from the beginning. Like, surely a big part of this movie is, how does this stuff affect you? What does it mean? Like, who are these people who do these jobs, and what does it mean? So a big part of this movie is that it's a character study. And so I don't think these four things, and I mean, this is just like random theories about them. These axes, they're not clear from the beginning. A big part of this movie is sort of understanding, like, whoa, like Nomi is like this, really extreme person. Why? What's she doing? Right? And you could jump to, well, this is a trash movie and they didn't know what they were doing. But I think if you stick with it a little bit, you can understand a lot of things that are kind of happening under the surface a little bit, right? Understand what is plaguing Nomi, and who is Crystal, right? Crystal is without a doubt a character to be studied. I mean, she's almost like on a pedestal in the film as like this thing to like, who is this? Like, who is she really? She's pretty obscure. Crystal isn't her real name, of course. And, you never know if she's to be trusted. You basically never get to the bottom of things with her either. And I think that's pretty interesting because, like I said, she's sort of on this pedestal. It's like, study this character, try to understand like what it's like, because she's the industry vet, right? She's the one who's been around. She's the one that Nomi might become. Remember this All About Eve kind of cyclical thing that's undergirding the movie too. So obviously you're thinking, okay, well, Nomi, is she going to turn into Crystal? What does that mean? Would that be good? Again, you're trying to chart some kind of moral course through this. Well, would it be good if she became like that? Would it be bad? Would she find herself through this, or would she lose herself through this, right? I think a profound part about the movie is that the closer and closer you look at Crystal, the more you realize that there's just a lot of layers that she's covered in. What is it? Well, hard to know. The industry. Such a big personality, and yet the real part of her is so small. Not unlike a certain character in All About Eve. Not unlike a certain character in that film. Okay, I could go on and on about this movie, but let me try and cut it short. What I can say is that I legitimately think this is a great movie. I think it's a deep movie, too. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in it. Okay. Is it like the greatest movie of all time? No. Of course, there's lots of stuff I didn't like about it. But I really do think it's tragic that it never got off the ground to the public and that it was never viewed in a fair light. It's not a huge mystery why, but it's a shame. I have heard rumors about people vouching for this film a bit more these days, maybe as a cult film or maybe as a serious movie. maybe I'm late to the party with this. Maybe there's already like a gazillion video essays on Showgirls. Honestly, I have no idea. Haven't looked it up. This is just how I felt about the movie after watching it and reading a few IMDb reviews. At first, I was a little bit skeptical about this movie. I'll admit that some of the characters feel like they've been plucked out of some kind of kids' TV show or like the corporate HR training video. Molly, for instance, I thought that was sort of a weak performance in some ways. But also, I mean, I just talked at length about how I think the overacting thing is a little bit of a crock. And in the end, I was really into the movie. I did feel like the ending was a little bit rushed. I mean, I mentioned already we could make a separate video just about the ending. It's so interesting, and I mean the sort of, well, yeah, I'm not going to spoil it, but the way that it sort of unfolds reminds you of a lot of other action, reminds you of action movies in some ways, and that's an interesting snafu there. And this is where some of Verhoeven's legacy is, maybe this slightly grindhouse thing or this person taking a stand, all this stuff. Maybe that comes into play, but in general, let me just say, I did like the ending, but it does kind of arrive a little bit quickly. You're like, oh shoot, the movie's over? I wish that it had happened. I wish that it had been longer. The script in this movie, I mean, look, if you hate the tone, if you hate the dialogue, that's one thing, but the script is tight, man. It's really clever. There's some great little twists in here, a lot of just little moments. I already mentioned that, for instance, there's a bit of a twist with Al, right? A lot of little things with that. Some really, really satisfying use of repetition. It feels kind of like this classic thing. It does justice to All About Eve, but it also just turns everything up to 11. Man, I like the movie. What can I say? By the end of it, I was deeply involved. I think there's uncertainty here. I think there is a lot to think about with the specifics of the industry, but I also think there's some truths for your life about, man, the decisions you make, the uncertainty that you face. If you watch Showgirls, remember to actually watch the movie with your own two eyes and an open mind. And good luck.